Frank Andrews cruised down Chestnut Avenue in his aging patrol car, its interior warmed by the weak glow of the autumn sun. The picturesque suburban street stretched out before him, lined with vibrant trees shedding their golden leaves. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint aroma of someone's backyard barbecue. It was the kind of neighborhood where doors were left unlocked, kids played until dusk, and neighbors knew each other's first names, a place where nothing terrible ever seemed to happen. But Frank knew better. The neighborhood buzzed with life. A group of boys raced their bikes down the sidewalk, their shouts and laughter blending with the rustling of leaves. A couple walked their golden retriever past Mrs. Harper's neatly trimmed garden, where the retired teacher was pruning her chrysanthemums. She waved at Frank as he drove by, and though he waved back, his mind was elsewhere. A familiar ache tightened his chest as his eyes caught sight of a father tossing a football to his son in their front yard. The boy, no older than 7, laughed as he fumbled the catch, his dad cheering him on. Frank turned away quickly, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Memories of his own son, Noah, flickered unbidden in his mind. The sound of his laughter, the weight of his small hand in Frank's. Noah would have been 13 this year. It had been 6 years since the accident, but the pain still hit like a sucker punch, leaving Frank breathless every time. Unit 432, we've got a report of a loose dog near Elmwood, crackled the radio, snapping Frank out of his thoughts. Copy that, he replied, his voice steady, though his heart wasn't. But before he could turn the car toward Elmwood, something caught his eye. A small figure standing unnaturally still near the corner of a yard. Frank slowed the car to a crawl, narrowing his eyes at the scene. It was a little girl, no older than 6, wearing a faded pink dress that hung loosely on her small frame. Her bare feet pressed against the cool sidewalk, and she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit with one arm. The toy's ears flopped awkwardly, its fur matted and threadbare. The girl's posture was rigid, her gaze locked on something distant, unfocused. Frank's instincts kicked in immediately. Something wasn't right. He'd spent 22 years on the force, and in that time, he'd learned to trust his gut. It had never steered him wrong. He pulled over carefully and stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate and slow. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called out, his voice soft and unthreatening. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Frank approached cautiously, keeping a few feet of distance between them. Her silence unnerved him. Most kids her age would have at least glanced at the shiny police car or at the officer trying to talk to them. "My name's Frank," he said gently, kneeling to her level. "I'm a police officer. Do you need help?" Her large brown eyes flicked to him for the briefest moment before returning to their vacant stare. She hugged the stuffed rabbit tighter, her small fingers trembling. "Are you lost?" Frank asked, keeping his tone as calm as possible. Still, she said nothing. Frank's gaze dropped to her feet. They were filthy, scratched in places, as if she'd been walking for hours without shoes. His concern deepened. The girl wasn't just lost. Something had happened to her. "Can you tell me your name?" He tried again. "Or where you live?" For a moment, Frank thought she might not answer at all. But then, in a voice so quiet it was barely audible, she whispered one word. "Danger." The single syllable sent a jolt through Frank's entire body. His pulse quickened as he leaned in slightly, his professional demeanor masking the rising tension within him. "Danger?" he repeated, his voice steady. "What kind of danger? Can you show me?" The girl didn't move at first, but then, with trembling fingers, she raised her arm and pointed. Her tiny hand gestured toward the house across the street, a beige, single-story home with white shutters and a neatly trimmed hedge. The front door was slightly ajar, an ominous gap revealing only darkness within. Frank's gut twisted. He knew the house belonged to Ted Larson, a quiet, middle-aged man who lived alone. Ted was the type of guy who kept his lawn immaculate, paid his bills on time, and exchanged pleasantries but little else with the neighbors. There had never been any complaints about him. But now, with the little girl pointing straight at his house, Frank felt an uneasy weight settle in his chest. "Stay here," Frank told the girl firmly. He reached for his radio as he turned toward the house. "Dispatch, this is Officer Andrews. I need backup on Chestnut Avenue, 1300 block. Possible situation involving a child, requesting units to approach without sirens." "Copy that, Officer Andrews," came the dispatcher's reply. "Units en route." Frank clipped the radio back to his belt and glanced at the girl. She stood frozen in place, clutching her rabbit like a lifeline. "I'll be right back," he reassured her. "You stay right here where I can see you, okay?" She nodded, just barely, her eyes never leaving the house. Frank approached the front porch, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. The open door creaked as the wind pushed it slightly wider, and he reached for his holstered weapon instinctively. Years of experience had taught him to expect the unexpected in moments like these. "Ted?" Frank called out, his voice firm but calm. "It's Officer Andrews. You home?" No response. The house was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of a television somewhere inside. Frank stepped into the dimly lit hallway, his hand hovering near his gun. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made his stomach turn. Family photos lined the walls, pictures of Ted with what appeared to be a younger sister, snapshots of holidays and summer trips. It all seemed so normal, yet something felt profoundly wrong. As Frank moved deeper into the house, his flashlight illuminated more unsettling details: a half-empty coffee cup on the kitchen counter, a chair pushed out as if someone had left in a hurry. The unease in his gut grew stronger with every step. Then, from somewhere upstairs came the faint creak of floorboards. Frank's breath caught as the faint creak echoed through the house. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Someone was upstairs. His years of training urged caution, but his instincts pushed him forward. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the tension was a tangible weight pressing against his chest. Hand on his weapon, Frank made his way toward the base of the staircase. The wooden steps loomed ahead, disappearing into shadows. He hesitated, listening intently, but no other sound came. His flashlight's beams swept across the narrow hallway, illuminating details that added to the growing unease. A small crack in a family photo frame, a lone sock discarded near the stairs, and the faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. "Ted?" Frank called again, his voice steady but loud enough to carry through the house. Nothing. With a deep breath, he began his ascent, each step creaking under his weight. His eyes scanned the upstairs landing, flashlight revealing closed doors on either side. The air grew heavier as he reached the top, a cool draft brushing against his face. He couldn't pinpoint where it came from, but it carried with it a faint chemical tang that made his nose wrinkle. The first door he approached was slightly ajar, revealing a bedroom inside. Frank pushed it open carefully with his foot, flashlight illuminating an unmade bed and a nightstand cluttered with papers, a lamp, and a half-empty glass of water. A framed photo rested on the dresser, Ted and a young woman, likely his sister. The room itself seemed ordinary, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He moved to the next door, gripping his flashlight tightly as he twisted the knob. The door opened smoothly, revealing a small office space. A desk stood against the far wall, a laptop sitting open but dark. Filing cabinets lined the room, their drawers neatly closed. A faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air. Frank glanced around, noting the meticulous organization of the space. For a man who lived alone, Ted seemed unnervingly tidy. He stepped inside, his flashlight catching the edge of something on the desk, a sticky note partially tucked under the laptop. It read, "Don't let it slip again. Check the basement." Frank's stomach churned. His grip tightened on the flashlight as he backed out of the room, scanning the hallway once more. Whatever it was, the note made it clear that something unusual was happening here, and it centered on the basement. He turned toward the last door at the end of the hall. Unlike the others, this one was shut tight, the wood scuffed and worn near the handle. Frank reached for the knob, his heart pounding in his chest as he twisted it open. The door swung inward, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The faint chemical smell grew stronger, mingling with the scent of damp earth. His flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, the beam swallowed by the shadows below. Frank hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to wait for backup. But then, a faint noise drifted up the stairs. A soft whimper, almost like a child crying. The sound froze him in place, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing down the staircase. "Is someone down there?" The whimpering stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that sent a chill down Frank's spine. He took a deep breath, steeling himself before stepping onto the first creaking stair. Back outside. Maddie, her name, as Frank would later learn, stood where he'd left her, her small frame barely visible against the backdrop of the neighborhood. She clutched the rabbit tightly, her gaze fixed on the house. The light autumn breeze ruffled her dress, but she didn't seem to notice. A neighbor passing by paused at the sight of her, frowning. "Everything okay, honey?" the older woman asked, but Maddie didn't respond. Her small hand simply pointed again, unwavering, toward the house where Frank had disappeared. The woman, now uneasy, pulled out her phone to call the non-emergency line, just as the distant sound of police sirens began to echo in the distance. Back inside, Frank's boots touched the basement floor with a soft thud. The air was thick and cold, the chemical scent almost overwhelming now. His flashlight illuminated the space, revealing a cluttered room filled with shelves lined with boxes and containers. Old tools hung from the walls, and a workbench in the corner was strewn with various mechanical parts. But it was the far corner of the room that drew his attention, a small metal door set into the concrete wall. Unlike the rest of the basement, this area seemed newer, as if it had been recently installed. The edges of the door were clean, free from the grime that coated the rest of the space. Frank moved cautiously toward it, his heart pounding harder with every step. He reached for the handle, but the door didn't budge, it was locked. "Dispatch, this is Officer Andrews," Frank said into his radio, his voice low. "I'm in the basement at 1354 Chestnut, requesting backup ASAP. Found something unusual, a locked compartment in the basement. No sign of the homeowner yet." "Copy that, Officer Andrews," came the dispatcher's reply. "Units are approximately 2 minutes out." Frank clipped the radio back onto his belt, his flashlight sweeping across the rest of the basement as he waited. He noticed something then, faint scuff marks on the floor leading toward the metal door. They were uneven, as if something heavy had been dragged across the concrete. The whimper came again. Frank's blood ran cold. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from behind the locked door. His grip tightened on his weapon as he called out, "Who's in there?" "This is the police." No response. Frank's mind raced. Protocol dictated that he wait for backup, but every instinct in his body screamed that time was running out. He couldn't risk it, not if there was someone behind that door. He scanned the room, his flashlight landing on the workbench. Among the scattered tools was a small crowbar. He grabbed it and jammed it into the seam of the metal door, using all his strength to pry it open. The door groaned in protest, but after a few moments it gave way, swinging open to reveal a narrow passage that led even deeper underground. The passage was barely more than a tunnel, its walls lined with dirt and reinforced with wooden beams. The faint whimpering grew louder now, more distinct, and Frank's heart ached at the sound. It was definitely a child. "Hang on," he called out, his voice firm but soothing. "I'm coming to help you." He moved quickly but carefully, his flashlight illuminating the path ahead. The tunnel led to a small room, its walls lined with what looked like soundproof padding. In the center of the room was a young boy, no older than 7, sitting on the ground with his knees pulled to his chest. His face was streaked with tears, his dark hair matted and dirty. Frank knelt down immediately, holstering his weapon. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly. "You're safe now. My name's Frank. I'm here to help." The boy didn't respond at first. his wide, fearful eyes locked on Frank's face. Slowly, though, he uncurled himself, and Frank saw the faint bruises on his wrists and ankles, evidence of restraints that had since been removed. "What's your name?" Frank asked, his voice gentle. The boy's lips trembled before he whispered, "Sammy." "Okay, Sammy, we're going to get you out of here," Frank said, offering his hand. Sammy hesitated for a moment before reaching out, his small fingers gripping Frank's hand tightly. Frank's flashlight flickered slightly as he led Sammy back through the tunnel, his mind racing with questions. Who had done this? Why? And more importantly, where were the others? The boy's small, trembling hand in his own was a reminder of the urgency of the situation. There could be more children, hidden or worse. "Sammy, can you tell me if anyone else is here?" Frank asked gently as they emerged from the narrow passage into the basement. The boy clutched his hand tighter, his wide eyes darting around the room. "There were others," Sammy whispered, his voice barely audible. "But they took them away last night." Frank crouched down to meet the boy's gaze, keeping his voice calm despite the dread that settled in his chest. "Do you remember how many? Or where they went?" Sammy shook his head. Tears welled up in his eyes, and his lower lip trembled. "I don't know. They didn't tell us anything, just said we had to be quiet." Frank placed a reassuring hand on Sammy's shoulder. "It's okay. You're safe now. I promise. I just need you to stay right here for a moment, all right?" Sammy nodded hesitantly, and Frank stood, his focus shifting to the sounds of approaching sirens outside. Finally. He moved back up the basement stairs, stepping out into the cool air as several patrol cars pulled up to the curb. Red and blue lights bathed the street, illuminating the growing crowd of curious neighbors. Officers poured out of their vehicles, their radios crackling with instructions. Captain Sarah Whitmore, a sharp and no-nonsense woman with decades of experience, stepped out of the lead car. Her presence commanded immediate respect, her tall frame and piercing blue eyes cutting through the chaos. "Reynolds," she barked, striding toward him. "What the hell's going on here?" Frank quickly briefed her on what he'd found: the locked compartment, the hidden tunnel, the boy. He kept his voice steady, but the urgency in his tone was impossible to miss. Whitmore's expression darkened as she processed the information. "You should have waited for backup before going in alone," she said sharply. "But good work finding the kid. Where is he now?" "In the basement. He's scared but seems okay," Frank replied. "There's more, Captain. He said there were other kids, but they were moved last night. We might still have time to catch whoever's behind this." Whitmore nodded, her mind already working through the next steps. "All right, let's secure the scene. Reynolds, you stay with the boy. I'll have a team sweep the house and search the surrounding area. If there's anything else to find, we'll find it." Frank returned to the basement, where Sammy was sitting on the edge of a wooden crate, his small frame dwarfed by the cluttered room around him. The boy looked up as Frank approached, his expression a mix of fear and cautious hope. "Hey, buddy," Frank said, crouching beside him. "Some other officers are here now. They're going to help us figure all this out, okay?" Sammy nodded, though he still clung to Frank like a lifeline. Will they come back for me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Frank's heart broke at the question. "Not a chance," he said firmly. "No one's going to hurt you again. I promise." The boy's eyes searched Frank's face as if trying to decide whether he could trust him. Finally, he nodded again, the tiniest bit of tension leaving his small body. Above them, the muffled sounds of officers moving through the house filtered down into the basement. Frank's radio crackled to life, Whitmore's voice cutting through the static. "Reynolds, we found something upstairs. You'd better come take a look." Upstairs, revelations. Frank guided Sammy to one of the responding officers, instructing them to stay with the boy before heading upstairs. Whitmore was standing in the kitchen, her arms crossed as she examined a pile of papers spread across the counter. "What is it?" Frank asked, his stomach tightening. Whitmore gestured to the documents, her expression grim. Ledgers, receipts, contact lists. It looks like whoever owns this house was involved in something big. These aren't just random kidnappings, Reynolds. This is organized. Frank leaned over the counter, scanning the papers. Many of the receipts bore the same butterfly logo he'd seen on the stuffed rabbit Sammy had been holding. A sick feeling settled in his gut as he pieced together the implications. "There's more," Whitmore said, leading him to the living room. She pointed to a hidden compartment in the floorboards that had been pried open by one of the officers. Inside were several passports, all with different names but featuring the same man's photo, Ted Larson. "He's been using aliases," Whitmore said. "And based on what we found so far, it looks like he's been operating for years. Moving kids, disguising his identity. This is bigger than anything we've dealt with before." Frank's jaw tightened. "And now he's gone," he said bitterly. "Slipped away while I was chasing shadows." Whitmore placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "This isn't on you, Reynolds. You found the boy. You uncovered all of this. Now we've got a trail to follow." Frank nodded, though the weight of his frustration remained. He couldn't shake the image of Maddie pointing at the house or Sammy's tear-streaked face. "What about the girl?" Whitmore asked, pulling him from his thoughts. Frank glanced out the front window where Maddie was sitting on the hood of a patrol car, still clutching her stuffed rabbit. She looked impossibly small against the backdrop of flashing lights and bustling officers. "She's the one who led me here," Frank said. "Without her, I don't know if I would have found Sammy, or any of this." Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. "She's brave. We'll get social services involved and make sure she's taken care of." Frank hesitated. "Captain, I think she's connected to this somehow. She might have been held with the others. She hasn't said much, but I think she's seen things." Whitmore frowned. "We'll handle her carefully. For now, let's focus on tracking down Larson. We've got units searching the surrounding area, but if he's smart, he's already long gone." Frank clenched his fists. The idea of Larson escaping, of continuing his horrific operation, was almost too much to bear. "We'll get him," Whitmore said, her tone firm, "and we'll find those kids." A fragile connection. Later that night, Frank sat on the steps of the station, nursing a cup of bitter coffee as he replayed the day's events in his mind. The weight of it all pressed heavily on his shoulders. The discovery of the tunnel, the boy's frightened eyes, Larson's escape. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. He looked up to see Maddie standing a few feet away, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. "Hey there," Frank said gently. "You okay?" Maddie nodded, though her expression was somber. She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, holding out the rabbit. Frank frowned. "What's this?" She pointed to the rabbit's paw, where the butterfly sticker was still stuck firmly in place. "It's theirs," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank's heart sank. "The other kids?" he asked. Maddie nodded. Frank took the rabbit carefully, his mind racing. The butterfly logo was more than just a sticker. It was a clue, a thread that could lead them to whoever was behind all of this. "You've been really brave," Frank told Maddie. "And because of you, we're going to stop them." I promise. Maddie's lips quirked into the faintest of smiles before she turned and walked back inside the station, leaving Frank alone with the rabbit and the weight of his promise. Frank couldn't sleep that night. The events of the day replayed over and over in his mind: the hidden compartment in Ted Larson's basement, the terrified eyes of Sammy, and Maddie's small voice whispering, "Danger." The house had been turned inside out by forensics, yet Larson had vanished, and the other children remained unaccounted for. But one thing was clear. The butterfly logo on Sammy's stuffed rabbit and the ledgers they'd found pointed to a broader operation, something methodical and chillingly calculated. Frank sat at his desk in the precinct's dimly lit bullpen, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. In front of him lay the stuffed rabbit, its button eyes staring back at him as if it held the answers he sought. Beside it, a pile of evidence bags contained the ledgers, receipts, and passports retrieved from Larson's house. He flipped through the documents for what felt like the 100th time, searching for anything he might have missed. The butterfly logo appeared repeatedly, on shipping invoices, packing slips, even a business card tucked into one of the ledgers. The card was plain, with no name or address, only the logo embossed in the corner and a single phone number printed in black ink. Frank picked up his phone, dialing the number without hesitation. It rang twice before disconnecting abruptly, leaving him with nothing but silence. Frustrated, he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "You're still here?" a familiar voice asked, pulling him from his thoughts. Detective Olivia Carter, his closest ally on the force, approached his desk carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She placed one in front of him, her dark curls pulled back into a loose ponytail. "I thought you'd gone home hours ago," Olivia said, sliding into the chair opposite him. "Couldn't sleep," Frank admitted, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong and bitter, just the way he liked it. Olivia glanced at the rabbit and the papers scattered across his desk. "You're chasing something, aren't you?" Frank nodded. "This logo, it's on everything. The receipts, the ledgers, even Sammy's stuffed animal. It's got to be a front for something bigger, but I can't figure out what." Olivia frowned, picking up one of the receipts. "A front like a business? Shipping company, maybe?" "Possibly," Frank said. "But if it is, they're good at covering their tracks. I called the number on this card. It's disconnected." Olivia studied the evidence for a moment before pulling out her phone. "Let me run a search. Maybe something will pop up." As Olivia worked, Frank's thoughts drifted back to Maddie. She'd been placed in the care of social services for the night, but her connection to the case gnawed at him. She'd seen things. He was sure of it. And her bravery in pointing him toward Larson's house had been the key to uncovering everything. He owed it to her, to Sammy, and to the other missing children to see this through. "Got something," Olivia said, breaking the silence. Frank leaned forward as she turned her phone to show him the screen. "The butterfly logo. It's registered to a company called Monarch Shipping. Small operation, mostly deals in transporting high-value goods. But here's the kicker. They've got a warehouse on the outskirts of town." Near the old Riverside Mill, Frank's heart raced. The Riverside Mill had been abandoned for years, its sprawling property a haven for vagrants and urban explorers. It was the perfect place to hide something or someone. "We need to check it out," Frank said, already grabbing his jacket. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this? If we're wrong, we'll catch hell for going in without proper clearance. If we're right," Frank countered, "we could save lives." Olivia sighed but nodded. "All right, but we're doing this by the book. No kicking down doors unless we have to." The Riverside Mill. The moon hung low in the sky as Frank and Olivia pulled into the gravel lot outside the mill. The massive structure loomed ahead, its rusted walls and broken windows casting eerie shadows in the pale light. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. Frank stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered weapon. Olivia followed, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered, scanning the area. "Keep your eyes open," Frank said. "If Larson's involved, he won't be working alone." They approached the building cautiously, their footsteps crunching against the gravel. The faint hum of machinery reached their ears, surprising them both. "Didn't think this place was operational," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not supposed to be," Frank replied. They reached a side door, its rusted hinges hanging crookedly. Frank pushed it open and the two stepped inside. The air grew colder and the hum of machinery grew louder, accompanied by faint voices coming from deeper within the building. Frank signaled for Olivia to follow as they moved through the labyrinth of corridors. Old machinery and stacks of wooden pallets lined the walls, casting long shadows in the dim light. The voices grew clearer, the sound of men speaking in low tones. Frank held up a hand, signaling Olivia to stop. They crouched behind a stack of crates, peering around the corner toward the source of the noise. In the center of the room, several men were loading crates into the back of a large truck. The crates bore the same butterfly logo, their sides stamped with Monarch shipping in bold letters. "There's our connection," Olivia whispered. Frank's jaw tightened as he scanned the room, noting the men's weapons and the presence of surveillance cameras mounted on the walls. This wasn't just a warehouse, it was an operation. "We need backup," Olivia said, reaching for her radio. Before she could call it in, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the room. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. "What the hell was that?" one of them barked. Frank and Olivia exchanged a glance. The sound had come from outside the room, but its timing couldn't have been worse. "Stay here," Frank whispered. "I'll check it out." Olivia nodded, her hand resting on her weapon as she kept her eyes on the men. Frank moved silently through the shadows, following the source of the noise. It led him to a small side room where he found an older man struggling with a stack of crates. The man froze when he saw Frank, his eyes widening in fear. "Don't move," Frank ordered, his voice low but firm. The man raised his hands, his voice shaking as he said, "I'm just the janitor. Please, I don't want any trouble." Frank frowned, studying the man carefully. His clothes were dirty, and he looked genuinely terrified. "Janitor, huh?" Frank said. "What's your name?" "Carl," the man replied. "I swear I just clean up around here. I didn't know what was going on. Please don't hurt me." Frank sighed, lowering his weapon slightly. "Carl, if you're telling the truth, I need your help. What's in those crates?" Carl hesitated, glancing nervously toward the main room. I don't know. They don't let me near them, but I've seen the kids." Frank's heart sank. "Kids? How many?" Carl shook his head. "I don't know. A few. They keep them in the basement until they're ready to move them." Frank's grip tightened on his weapon. "Show me." The final discovery. Carl led Frank to a hidden staircase behind a stack of crates. The steps descended into darkness, the air growing colder with each step. Frank's flashlight revealed a series of small rooms, their walls lined with mattresses and blankets. Toys were scattered across the floor, a doll missing an arm, a small plastic truck, and a puzzle with pieces missing. Frank's jaw clenched as he stepped into one of the rooms, his flashlight falling on a small, tattered shoe. It was unmistakable now. This was where the children had been held. "We're getting them," Frank said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "No matter what it takes." The dim light from their flashlights glinted off the rusted padlock. Frank knelt in front of the metal chest, his gloved hands carefully brushing away the thick layer of grime that had built up over years of neglect. The weight of what this could mean settled heavily on his shoulders. "Can you get it open?" Alvarez asked, his voice low, though the tension in the air made it feel louder. Frank nodded grimly and reached for the multi-tool on his belt. He worked carefully, the sound of metal scraping against metal echoing in the cramped hidden room. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the coolness of the basement, and his jaw tightened as the lock resisted. Finally, with a sharp crack, the rusted padlock broke apart and clattered to the ground. Frank hesitated for a moment before lifting the heavy lid of the chest. The stale air inside carried the faint scent of damp paper and mildew. Both men leaned in, their flashlights revealing the chest's contents: files, photographs, and what appeared to be old audio tapes stacked neatly inside. Frank's heart raced as he reached for the topmost folder. "It's a ledger," he murmured, flipping through the pages. The names, dates, and amounts scrawled across the yellowed paper told a chilling story. Payments made, locations listed, and initials marked in precise handwriting. Alvarez picked up a photograph that had been tucked into one of the files. It was black and white, grainy, and depicted a group of children standing in a line. Their faces were blank with fear, their small shoulders hunched. In the corner of the photograph was the unmistakable butterfly logo, stamped as if branding the image with its sinister symbol. "Jesus," Alvarez muttered, turning the photograph over. On the back was a list of names, handwritten in a delicate script. Frank's eyes scanned the names, and his breath caught when he saw one that leapt out at him. "Maya," he whispered, Her name was there, alongside others, with a date written next to it 2 months ago. "These files are gold," Alvarez said, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. "If we can match these names to missing persons reports, it's the smoking gun we need." Frank nodded, his mind racing. This was it, evidence that couldn't be easily destroyed or dismissed. But as he reached for another folder, a sound from above made both men freeze. Footsteps. The ambush. Frank and Alvarez exchanged a glance, their bodies tensing instinctively. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. They were no longer alone. "Move," Frank whispered, quickly closing the chest and motioning for Alvarez to follow him. They carefully slid the machinery back into place, concealing the hidden compartment just as the faint glow of flashlights danced on the walls of the main basement. The two men ducked behind a large stack of crates, their breaths shallow as the intruders approached. Frank counted at least 4 figures, all moving with precision. Their boots thudded against the concrete floor, the sound reverberating through the cavernous space. "They're checking for us," Alvarez murmured. Frank nodded. They must have been watching the building. Probably knew we'd come back. The intruders stopped near the spot where the hidden compartment lay. One of them, a tall figure wearing a ski mask, knelt down, running a gloved hand over the wall where the chest had been concealed. "Someone's been here," the figure said, his voice low but laced with authority. Frank tightened his grip on his weapon, his mind racing. If they were discovered, there would be no negotiating. These men weren't here to intimidate. They were here to eliminate. Another voice spoke, gruff and commanding. "Search the entire area. If they're still here, take them out." Alvarez's eyes met Frank's, and both men knew their options were limited. They couldn't afford to lose the evidence they'd just uncovered, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Frank gestured toward the emergency tunnel they had used to escape during the fire. It was a long shot, but it might be their only way out. Alvarez nodded, and the two began to move as quietly as possible, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. One of the masked men turned suddenly, his flashlight sweeping dangerously close to their position. Frank and Alvarez froze, their bodies pressed against the cold concrete wall. The beam of light passed just inches from their faces before moving on. "Keep going," Frank mouthed. They reached the emergency tunnel and slipped inside, the darkness swallowing them. The sound of their pursuers grew fainter as they crawled through the narrow passage, the cool earth pressing against their hands and knees. When they finally emerged into the open air, both men were gasping for breath. The night sky stretched above them, stars barely visible through the haze of city lights. "We need to move," Alvarez said, his voice tight. Frank nodded, pulling out his phone and dialing the captain. "We've got evidence," he said as soon as she picked up. "But they know we've been here. Send backup now." A dangerous revelation. Back at the station, Frank and Alvarez worked late into the night, combing through the files they'd recovered. The evidence was damning. Detailed accounts of payments, transportation routes, and even photographs of the children involved. "This isn't just local," Alvarez said, his finger tracing a map that had been included in one of the folders. "They've got operations in multiple states. Look, drop-off points in Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta." Frank stared at the map, his stomach churning. The scale of the operation was staggering. "And it all leads back to Marshall," he said. Alvarez nodded grimly. "His name is all over these documents. Donations to front organizations, payments disguised as real estate transactions. It's a shell game, but the trail is there if you know where to look." Frank leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at him. But he couldn't stop. Not now. He thought of Maya, of Sammy, of the countless other children whose names appeared in the files. They deserved justice. "We need to bring this to the feds," Frank said. "This is bigger than us." Alvarez hesitated. "You sure? If Marshall gets wind of this before we've got federal support, he'll bury us, and this time he'll make sure we don't get back up." Frank's jaw tightened. "We don't have a choice. The longer we wait, the more kids disappear." The fluorescent lights in the FBI field office buzzed faintly as Frank and Alvarez stood before a group of federal agents, their evidence spread across a long conference table. Photographs, ledgers, and maps were meticulously arranged, creating a chilling timeline of the trafficking operation. The tension in the room was palpable, every agent silent as Frank finished his explanation. "We believe Andrew Marshall is at the center of this," Frank said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "He's been using his businesses and charities as a front to fund and organize this operation. The files we recovered confirm it. Routes, payments, and locations all point back to him." One of the agents, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Hensley, leaned forward. "This is a strong case," she admitted, her tone cautious. "But it's circumstantial for now. We need something that ties him directly to the trafficking, something irrefutable." Frank glanced at Alvarez, who nodded. "We've got a witness," Frank said. "A young girl who escaped from one of their facilities. She described a woman with a butterfly necklace, a symbol that appears throughout the operation's records. She also mentioned the sound of crying in Marshall's home. She's seen things that could blow this case wide open." Hensley frowned. "A child's testimony will be scrutinized heavily in court, especially if she's traumatized. The defense will argue she's unreliable." Frank's jaw tightened. "She's not lying. She remembers details, things no 5-year-old could invent, and we've matched her information to the files we recovered." Hensley studied him for a long moment before nodding. "We'll authorize surveillance on Marshall. If he's as careful as you say, he won't slip up easily. But with enough eyes on him, we might catch something." "What about the children still missing?" Alvarez asked. "We'll issue BOLOS for the locations listed in the files," Hensley replied. "But it's clear this operation is highly mobile. They could be moving the kids as we speak." Frank felt a knot of frustration tighten in his chest. He hated the waiting game, the feeling of being one step behind. But he knew the FBI's involvement was their best shot at taking Marshall down. "Reynolds, Alvarez," Hensley said, her tone firm. "We'll coordinate with your department, but be smart about this. Marshall's influence extends far, and if he catches wind of what we're doing, he'll bury this operation before we can act." Frank nodded, though the weight of the task ahead felt heavier than ever. The quiet before the storm. Back in his precinct, Frank sat in his office, staring at Maya's drawing of the butterfly necklace. The small crayon lines were delicate but precise, a child's memory etched with startling clarity. He thought of her bravery, her quiet determination to help, despite everything she'd endured. "Frank," Alvarez said, stepping into the room. His expression was grim, a man caught between duty and friendship. "We've got eyes on Marshall. The FBI set up surveillance near his house and they're monitoring his known associates. But you know how this works. It could take weeks, maybe months, to get something actionable." Frank ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Every day we wait, those kids get farther away. We don't have weeks, Alvarez." "I get it," Alvarez said. "But we've got to play this smart. You've already been in hot water with the department, and if Marshall's got ears here, one wrong move could cost us everything." Frank leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew Alvarez was right, but the thought of sitting idle while children were in danger was unbearable. "You need to rest," Alvarez added, his tone softening. "You've been running on fumes since this started." Frank shook his head. "I can't. Not until we find them." A risky lead. The next morning, Frank was jolted awake by the sound of his phone buzzing on his desk. He blinked blearily at the screen, Mrs. Cooper's number. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Is everything okay?" "It's Maya," Mrs. Cooper replied, her tone urgent. She remembered something else. She said it's important. Frank was on his feet immediately. "I'm on my way." When he arrived at the foster home, Maya was waiting for him in the living room, her stuffed bear clutched tightly against her chest. Mrs. Cooper sat beside her, a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What is it, Maya?" Frank asked gently, kneeling to meet her eye level. Maya hesitated, her small fingers fidgeting with the bear's fur. "The butterfly lady," she whispered, She had a book. A book? Frank repeated, his brow furrowing. Maya nodded. She wrote in it all the time. It had a butterfly on the cover and she always kept it with her. Frank's heart raced. If this book was real, it could be the key to everything. A record of transactions, locations, or even names. "Do you remember anything else about the book?" he asked, his voice steady despite his excitement. "It was red," Maya said softly, "and the pages were old, like they'd been used a lot." Frank reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maya, you've helped us so much already. This is really important. We're going to find that book, and we're going to stop the butterfly lady." The tipping point. Armed with Maya's new information, Frank returned to the precinct and immediately called Alvarez. "If that book exists, it's got to be in Marshall's possession," he said. Alvarez frowned. "That's a big assumption. He's too careful to keep something that incriminating lying around." "Then where else would it be?" Frank countered. "Maya said the butterfly lady always had it with her. If she's tied to Marshall, the book might be the one thing he wouldn't let out of his sight." Alvarez sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Even if you're right, we can't exactly storm his house looking for it." "We don't have to," Frank said, an idea forming in his mind. "The FBI's got surveillance on him, right? If we can figure out where he keeps it, we can get a warrant." "That's a long shot," Alvarez warned. "Maybe," Frank admitted, "but it's all we've got." A game of cat and mouse. Over the next several days, Frank worked closely with the FBI team, poring over the footage from Marshall's home. The man was careful, his movements calculated. He rarely left the house, and when he did, it was always for public events or tightly controlled meetings. But on the fourth night of surveillance, something changed. Marshall left his home shortly after midnight, accompanied by two men in dark suits. They drove to a storage facility on the outskirts of town, their car disappearing into the shadows of the sprawling complex. "That's it," Frank said, watching the live feed. "The book's in there." Hensley frowned. "We don't know that for sure. It could be anything." "It's worth the risk," Frank insisted. The raid with a warrant secured, Frank, Alvarez, and the FBI team descended on the storage facility the following night. The air was electric with tension as they approached the unit Marshall had entered. "On my count," Hensley said, her weapon drawn. 3, 2, 1. The door was forced open, revealing a small, meticulously organized room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes, files, and binders. And there, on the center table, was a red book with a butterfly embossed on the cover. Frank stepped forward, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The pages were filled with names, dates, and locations. Evidence that left no doubt about the scale of the operation. "We got him," Alvarez said, his voice filled with both relief and determination. Frank carefully flipped through the brittle pages of the red book, each one filled with damning evidence. The handwriting was neat, almost meticulous, as if the person keeping the records had taken pride in their heinous work. The book contained everything: payment logs, transportation routes, and detailed notes on each child, names, ages, locations, and, chillingly, physical descriptions. Alvarez stood beside him, his flashlight illuminating the pages. "This is it," he said, his voice a mix of awe and anger. "This ties everything together." Frank nodded, his jaw clenched. "We need to secure this immediately. No delays. No missteps." Agent Hensley, who had been examining the rest of the storage unit with her team, walked over. "What have you got?" Frank held up the book. "It's all here. The names, the logistics. It's enough to bring Marshall down." Hensley's sharp eyes scanned the pages. "This is what we've been waiting for. I'll get it back to the field office and under lock and key. We'll digitize the contents and start cross-referencing it with missing persons reports." "No," Frank said firmly, surprising both Alvarez and Hensley. "I'm taking it to the station first. This started here and I'm not letting it leave without a fight." Hensley raised an eyebrow. "Reynolds, I understand your dedication, but this evidence is now part of a federal investigation. It's protocol. Protocol didn't get us here. Frank cut in, his voice low but resolute. Maya trusted me to find these kids. I'm not handing this over until I know we have a solid plan to use it. You can send your team to the station if you want, but this book stays with me for now. For a moment, Hensley looked ready to argue, but something in Frank's expression stopped her. She nodded curtly. Fine. But this puts you on the clock, Reynolds. We can't afford to lose momentum. Back at the precinct. By the time Frank and Alvarez returned to the station, the sky was beginning to lighten, a soft gray signaling the arrival of dawn. The bullpen was quiet, the usual chaos of the day shift still hours away. Frank set the red book down on his desk with a sense of reverence, as though it were a sacred artifact. Alvarez sat across from him, his expression heavy with exhaustion. You realize Marshall's going to come for this, right? If he finds out we have it, he won't stop until it's gone, and neither will his people. I know, Frank said, his eyes never leaving the book. But this is our chance, Alvarez. We've got him pinned. Now we just have to act fast. As Frank began scanning the pages into the station's secure server, Alvarez sifted through the information. The names in the book were haunting, each one representing a child whose life had been upended. Some of the entries were marked with dates that corresponded to reported disappearances, while others hinted at darker fates. Here, Alvarez said, pointing to a page. This entry matches Maya, age, location, and even the date of her escape. Frank's stomach churned as he read the notes beside her name. Unruly, high risk of exposure, contain immediately. He exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk. They were going to silence her. She escaped just in time. Alvarez nodded grimly. We need to move on this fast. The longer we wait, the more time Marshall has to cover his tracks. The community responds. As the day progressed, news of the storage unit raid began to spread through the precinct and the town. Despite Frank's best efforts to keep the details under wraps, word leaked that the raid had uncovered significant evidence tied to the missing children. Outside the station, a small group of reporters had already gathered, their cameras trained on the entrance. Frank ignored them as he stepped outside to grab a much-needed breath of fresh air. A familiar voice called out to him. Officer Reynolds! He turned to see Mrs. Cooper hurrying toward him, Maya in tow. The little girl clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her eyes scanning the crowd nervously. Mrs. Cooper, Frank said, his tone softening. What are you doing here? Maya insisted on coming, Mrs. Cooper said, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. She wanted to make sure you were okay. Frank crouched down to Maya's level, offering her a reassuring smile. I'm okay, Maya. Thanks to you, we're making progress. We found something important last night, something that's going to help us find the other kids. Maya's eyes lit up with cautious hope. The butterfly lady? She asked. Frank nodded. We're closing in on her, and on the people who hurt you and the others. You've been so brave, Maya. I promise we're going to stop them. Mrs. Cooper gave Frank a small, grateful smile. She believes in you, Officer Reynolds. And so do I. Marshall strikes back. Later that evening, as Frank and Alvarez continued combing through the red book, the station's power suddenly flickered. The overhead lights dimmed for a moment before returning to full strength. What the hell was that? Alvarez muttered, glancing up from his computer. Before Frank could answer, his phone buzzed. It was Hensley. Reynolds, we've got a problem, she said, her voice sharp. Our surveillance on Marshall just caught a disturbance. He's on the move, and he doesn't look happy. Define on the move, Frank said, his pulse quickening. He's got a convoy of SUVs heading out of town, Hensley replied. And they're moving fast. We're trying to track them, but... She hesitated. You need to be careful. If he knows you have the book, he won't stop until he gets it back. Frank hung up and turned to Alvarez. We're out of time. Marshall knows. Alvarez swore under his breath. We need to get this evidence out of here now. But before they could act, the station's main doors slammed open, and Captain Whitmore stormed in. Her expression was a mix of fury and fear. "Reynolds, Alvarez, my office, now." A shifting tide. Inside Whitmore's office, the air was thick with tension. She paced back and forth, her arms crossed tightly. "I just got a call from the mayor," she began, her voice sharp. "Apparently, Marshall's lawyers are threatening to sue the department for harassment and defamation. They're claiming the raid on the storage unit was illegal." Frank's jaw tightened. "We had a warrant. Everything was by the book." Whitmore stopped pacing and fixed him with a hard stare. "It doesn't matter. Marshall's playing the long game here, and he's got the resources to make our lives hell. If we don't handle this carefully, we'll lose everything we've worked for." "Captain," Alvarez said, his tone measured, "the evidence we found is solid. It ties Marshall directly to the trafficking operation. We can't back down now." Whitmore sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I know. But this is bigger than any of us. We need to be strategic. No more rogue moves, Reynolds. No more risks. Understood?" Frank nodded, though his mind was already racing with contingency plans. Chaos erupted as the guards on the docks scrambled to react. Several dropped their weapons and raised their hands, their faces pale with fear. But others, emboldened by their loyalty to Andrew Marshall, or perhaps fear of what would happen if they betrayed him, opened fire. Frank ducked behind a stack of crates as bullets ricocheted off the metal shipping containers nearby. The sharp staccato of gunfire filled the air, accompanied by the shouted commands of officers and the panicked cries of guards being subdued. "Team 2, secure the east entrance," Frank barked into his radio, peeking out from behind cover to assess the situation. To his left, Alvarez moved with practiced precision, taking cover and returning fire when necessary. The determination on his face was unshakable, even with the bruises and injuries from their recent escape still visible. "Frank," Alvarez called out, pointing toward the shipping containers near the far side of the warehouse. "That's where they're holding the kids." Frank nodded and signaled for his team to follow. "Move to the containers," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Let's get those kids out of there." The officers advanced, their tactical training evident as they used cover and coordinated movements to suppress the remaining guards. Frank's heart raced as he neared the containers, the thought of the children trapped inside pushing him forward. Breaking the chains. Frank reached the first container and found a large padlock securing the doors. He motioned for one of the officers to cover him while he grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from his gear. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. "Cover me," he yelled, kneeling down to cut through the lock. Each crunch of the bolt cutters felt like a small victory. With a final snap, the lock fell away. Frank threw the doors open, revealing a group of frightened children huddled inside. Their faces were pale, their clothes dirty, and their eyes wide with terror. "It's okay," Frank called out, his voice as calm and gentle as he could make it. "We're here to help. You're safe now." The children hesitated for a moment, their fear holding them back. But then one little girl stepped forward, clutching a tattered blanket. Her courage seemed to spark something in the others, and soon they were all moving toward Frank and the officers. One by one, the children were carefully lifted out of the container and into the waiting arms of social workers and medics who had arrived on the scene. Frank's chest tightened as he thought of Maya, imagining her in a similar situation just weeks ago. "Frank, we've got another container over here," Alvarez called from nearby. Frank sprinted toward the second container, bolt cutters in hand. This time, the lock was heavier, but his determination outweighed the obstacle. Within moments, the doors were open, and another group of children was freed. "Is that all of them?" one of the officers asked, scanning the area. Frank glanced around, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Check every container. We can't leave anyone behind." As the officers continued to secure the scene, the distant roar of an engine drew Frank's attention. He turned just in time to see a black SUV screech to a halt near the edge of the docks. The driver's door opened and Andrew Marshall stepped out, his polished appearance a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He looked furious, his normally composed demeanor shattered. "Reynolds," Marshall shouted, his voice carrying across the dock, "do you have any idea what you've done?" Frank straightened, his weapon still in hand. He approached Marshall cautiously, flanked by 2 officers. "You're under arrest, Marshall," he said, his voice steady. "We've got everything we need to bring you down." Marshall laughed bitterly, spreading his arms wide as if daring them to act. "You think this changes anything? You're a small-town cop playing hero, but you don't understand how deep this goes. You can arrest me, but it won't stop what's coming." Frank's jaw tightened. "Maybe not, but it's a start." Before Marshall could respond, Alvarez stepped forward with the red ledger in hand. "This is all we need to connect you to the trafficking operation," he said. "Your time's up, Marshall." For a moment, Marshall's confident mask slipped, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Frank took a step closer. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A coward who profits off the suffering of children. And I'm going to make sure you pay for every single one of them." Marshall's eyes narrowed, but before he could make another move, the officers moved in, placing him in handcuffs. Aftermath. As the dawn broke over the docks, the chaos began to subside. The rescued children were loaded into ambulances, their faces weary but hopeful. Social workers comforted them, while medics checked for injuries. Frank stood near the water's edge, his arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold. Despite the exhaustion weighing on him, a sense of relief began to creep in. They had done it. Alvarez approached, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We got them, Frank. Every one of those kids is safe because of you." Frank shook his head. "Because of us," he corrected, "and because of Maya. Without her, we wouldn't have gotten this far." Alvarez nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You should tell her. She deserves to know what she helped accomplish." A visit to Maya. Later that day, Frank arrived at the foster home, a bouquet of wildflowers in hand. Maya was outside, riding her bike in slow, deliberate circles. When she saw Frank, her face lit up, and she raced toward him, her bear tucked into the bike's basket. "Frank?" she called out, hopping off her bike and running to him. Frank knelt down, offering her the flowers. "These are for you," he said. Maya's smile grew as she accepted the bouquet. "Did you catch the bad people?" Frank nodded, his voice steady but emotional. "We did. And it's because of you, Maya. You helped us find them and save the other kids. You're a hero." Maya hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "I'm glad you didn't give up," she whispered. Frank held her close, his throat tight with emotion. "Neither did you," he said softly. A community transformed. In the weeks that followed, the town began to heal. The news of Andrew Marshall's arrest spread quickly, shocking many who had once trusted him. His empire crumbled under the weight of the evidence, and more arrests were made as his associates were identified. The children rescued from the docks were reunited with their families or placed in caring foster homes, their futures no longer overshadowed by fear. Frank returned to work, his reputation restored. His colleagues now looked at him with respect, recognizing the lengths he had gone to for justice. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, his sister Rachel joined him, handing him a cold beer. "You did good, Frank," she said simply. Frank took a sip, nodding. "We all did." Rachel smiled. "And what about you? You ready to let people in again?" Frank thought of Maya, Alvarez, and everyone who had stood by him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I am." Even with Andrew Marshall behind bars and the trafficking operation dismantled, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. He knew too well how organized crime worked. There were always layers, always someone waiting in the shadows to step up when a leader fell. The police station hummed with activity as agents and officers processed evidence, followed up on leads, and prepared for the upcoming trial. Despite the small victory, a lingering unease settled in Frank's gut. Detective Alvarez approached him, holding a file in one hand and a fresh cup of coffee in the other. "We've got something you'll want to see," he said, his expression serious. Frank took the file and opened it. Inside were photos taken from the storage unit and Marshall's properties, including pictures of ledgers, shipping manifests, and surveillance equipment. One photo in particular caught his eye, a blurry image of a man's face partially obscured by shadows. "Who's this?" Frank asked, tapping the photo. "We're still trying to identify him," Alvarez said. "He's shown up in several pieces of evidence, but his name doesn't appear anywhere. It's like he's a ghost." Frank studied the photo closely. The man's features were hard to make out, but there was something about the sharp lines of his jaw and the coldness in his eyes that set Frank on edge. "He's involved somehow," Frank said. "We need to find out who he is." "Already on it," Alvarez replied. "But if he's as careful as Marshall was, it won't be easy." Maya's recovery. Meanwhile, Maya's life had started to settle into a new kind of normal. Under Mrs. Cooper's care, she began to blossom, her laughter filling the small foster home as she played with other children or rode her bike around the neighborhood. But the shadows of her past hadn't disappeared completely. She still had nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night with tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Cooper always comforted her, sitting by her bed and reminding her that she was safe now. One evening, as the sun set in hues of orange and pink, Frank stopped by the foster home. He brought a small gift for Maya, a set of art supplies wrapped in colorful paper. Maya's eyes lit up as she tore into the package. Inside, she found sketch pads, pencils, markers, and crayons. "I thought you might like to draw," Frank said, smiling. Maya nodded eagerly. "I'm going to draw something for you," she declared, already pulling out a pencil and flipping open the sketch pad. As she worked, Frank sat on the couch with Mrs. Cooper, who poured them both cups of tea. "She's doing better," Mrs. Cooper said softly, glancing at Maya. "But she still has a long way to go." Frank nodded, his gaze lingering on the little girl who had been so brave. "She's stronger than most adults I know," he said. "She'll get through this." When Maya finished her drawing, she ran over to Frank, holding it out proudly. It was a simple picture of a police officer standing in front of a bright sun, surrounded by flowers. Above the officer's head, Maya had drawn a butterfly in vibrant purple and gold. "That's you," Maya said, pointing to the officer, "because you're the one who makes the bad people go away." Frank swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Maya. This means a lot to me." At the trial of Andrew Marshall. The trial of Andrew Marshall became one of the most high-profile cases the town had ever seen. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and community members eager to see justice served. Marshall's team of high-powered attorneys fought tooth and nail to discredit the evidence, painting Frank and Alvarez as rogue officers who had violated procedure to pursue a personal vendetta. But the prosecution had the truth on their side. The red ledger, the rescued children's testimonies, and Claire Marshall's damning testimony all painted a clear picture of Andrew Marshall's guilt. Claire sat on the witness stand, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "For years, I looked the other way," she admitted, her hands gripping the edges of the stand. "I was too afraid to stand up to my brother, but when I realized what he was doing, when I saw the children, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." Marshall sat stoically at the defense table, his expression unreadable. But Frank, seated in the gallery, noticed the way his jaw tightened every time Claire spoke. When it was Frank's turn to testify, he recounted the events of the case with precision and clarity. He described finding the red ledger, rescuing the children, and Maya's bravery in coming forward with critical information. The defense tried to rattle him, questioning his methods and motivations. But Frank remained composed, his resolve unshaken. "You claim you acted in the best interests of these children," one of Marshall's lawyers said, pacing in front of the jury. "But isn't it true that you were driven by personal trauma? That you acted out of desperation rather than sound judgment?" Frank met the lawyer's gaze head on. "I did what I had to do to save those kids," he said firmly. If you want to call that desperation, go ahead, but I call it justice. A shocking revelation. As the trial dragged on, new information came to light. One of the rescued children, a boy named Sammy, had overheard a conversation between two of the guards while he was being held. The guards had mentioned the benefactor, a shadowy figure who funded and oversaw the entire operation. The benefactor was careful to remain hidden, but the name sent ripples through the investigation team. Who was this person, and how deeply were they involved? Agent Hensley called a meeting with Frank and Alvarez to discuss the new lead. If there's someone above Marshall pulling the strings, we need to find them, she said. This operation was too big for one man to handle alone. Frank nodded, his jaw set. We'll start with the names in the red ledger. Someone in there has to know more. The hunt continues. While Marshall's conviction seemed inevitable, the hunt for the benefactor added a new layer of urgency to the case. Frank and Alvarez worked tirelessly, poring over the ledger and cross-referencing names with known associates of Marshall. One name stood out, Victor Kane, a wealthy businessman with ties to international shipping companies. His name appeared multiple times in the ledger, often linked to large payments and suspicious transactions. We need to bring him in for questioning, Frank said, tapping Kane's name on the document. Alvarez nodded. I'll notify Hensley. But if this guy is as connected as Marshall, we'll need to move fast. He could disappear the moment he hears we're onto him. Confrontation. The team tracked Victor Kane to his sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. Frank, Alvarez, and a team of FBI agents arrived early in the morning, armed with a warrant. Kane greeted them at the door with a calm smile, his expensive suit and polished demeanor a stark contrast to the seriousness of the situation. Officers, he said smoothly, what can I do for you? We have a warrant to search your property, Hensley said, holding up the document. Kane's smile faltered slightly, but he stepped aside. Of course, he said, though I can assure you you won't find anything of interest here. As the agents began their search, Frank and Alvarez questioned Kane in his lavish living room. The man was charming and evasive, deflecting every question with practiced ease. I don't know what you're talking about, Kane said, sipping from a crystal glass of whiskey. I'm a legitimate businessman. Whatever this is, you've got the wrong man. But as the search continued, an agent called out from the study. We've found something. Frank and Alvarez rushed to the room, where the agent held up a USB drive. It was hidden in a locked drawer, the agent explained. Frank took the drive, his heart pounding. Whatever was on it, he knew it could be the key to unraveling the rest of the operation. The fluorescent lights in the station buzzed softly overhead as Frank sat at his desk, the weight of everything they'd accomplished settling over him. The red ledger and Maya's bravery had been the catalyst for uncovering the horrors of Andrew Marshall's operation. But even now, as the case reached its conclusion, Frank knew the shadows of such evil didn't vanish overnight. Maya's Light, the new community initiative, was thriving. Flyers had been distributed across schools, churches, and local businesses, and the program was already making an impact. The hotline established through the program had received dozens of calls, several of which had led to actionable cases of abuse or neglect. Frank's role had shifted slightly. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He had become a mentor, a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. Alvarez liked to joke that Frank was becoming the face of hope in their small town. Though Frank brushed it off with a gruff laugh, deep down he felt a sense of pride. Another whisper. Late one evening, Frank was filing reports when his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Mrs. Cooper. Mrs. Cooper, Frank answered, his tone light. How's our favorite superhero doing? Maya's fine, Mrs. Cooper said warmly. She wanted me to call you because she has something to tell you. There was some rustling, and then Maya's small voice came through the line. Frank, guess what? What's that, kiddo? I'm getting adopted, she said excitedly. The Hendersons want me to stay forever. Frank's heart swelled. That's wonderful news, Maya. They're lucky to have you. And I get my own room, she added, her excitement bubbling over. I'm going to paint it purple with butterflies, just like the ones in the program. You'll have to invite me over to see it when it's done, Frank said, smiling. Promise, Maya replied, and Frank could hear her grinning. As the call ended, Frank leaned back in his chair, the weight of the world feeling a little lighter. Maya's new beginning was a reminder of why he had fought so hard. The final puzzle piece. The investigation into Andrew Marshall's operation had uncovered many layers of corruption, but the name Victor Kane, linked to the benefactor, still haunted Frank. Agents had scoured Kane's estate after finding the USB drive, but he had vanished, leaving behind only fragments of his operation. One late afternoon, Frank and Alvarez met with Agent Hensley to review the latest findings. The USB drive had contained transaction records, emails, and correspondence that tied Kane directly to international trafficking networks. How did he slip away? Alvarez asked, frustration lacing his tone. Hensley sighed, rubbing her temples. He had resources we didn't anticipate, private planes, offshore accounts, you name it. But we'll get him. It's only a matter of time. Frank studied the files spread across the table. He's not going to stop. Kane's too invested in this to let it go. But if he resurfaces, we'll be ready. Justice served. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Andrew Marshall was escorted inside for his sentencing. The trial had been grueling, with Marshall's defense team doing everything they could to paint him as a scapegoat for a larger conspiracy. But the overwhelming evidence, including Claire Marshall's testimony and the Red Ledger, had left no room for doubt. Inside the packed courtroom, Frank sat beside Alvarez, watching as the judge delivered the sentence. Andrew Marshall, you have betrayed the trust of this community and committed unspeakable crimes against its most vulnerable members, the judge said sternly. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Frank remained still, his gaze fixed on Marshall. For the first time, the man's confident facade had cracked. His shoulders slumped as the weight of the sentence settled over him. As Marshall was led away, he glanced at Frank, his eyes filled with malice. But Frank didn't flinch. He simply watched as the man who had caused so much pain disappeared through the heavy wooden doors. The celebration. A few weeks later, the community came together for the official launch of Maya's Light. The event was held in the town square, where a stage had been set up surrounded by booths offering resources for families. Maya, now officially adopted by the Hendersons, stood on stage with Frank and Alvarez. She wore a purple dress with a small butterfly pin on her chest, her bright smile lighting up the crowd. When it was Frank's turn to speak, he approached the microphone with quiet confidence. He wasn't one for speeches, but this moment felt too important not to address. Today isn't about the past, he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. It's about the future. It's about making sure that no child in our community ever feels alone or afraid again. He glanced at Maya, who gave him an encouraging nod. Maya reminded me of something I'd forgotten, he continued. Even the smallest voice can make a big difference. And today, we're all here to make sure those voices are heard. The crowd erupted in applause and Frank stepped back, allowing Maya to take his place at the microphone. Thank you for helping kids like me, she said simply, her voice clear and strong. Because now I'm not scared anymore. A quiet moment later that evening, Frank walked Maya back to her new home. The Hendersons had invited him over for dinner, and the warm atmosphere reminded him of his own family's gatherings. As they approached the house, Maya tugged on his sleeve. Do you think the bad people will ever come back? She asked, her voice small. Frank knelt down, looking her in the eye. I'll do everything I can to make sure they don't, he said firmly. And if they do, you know what to do, right? Maya nodded. Be brave and tell someone. That's right, Frank said, smiling. As they reached the porch, Maya hugged him tightly. Thanks for saving me, she whispered. Frank swallowed hard, his throat tight. You saved yourself, Maya. I just helped. Looking ahead. Months passed, and the town began to heal. Frank continued his work as a detective but found himself more involved in community outreach than ever before. The scars of the case remained, but they were no longer the defining feature of his life. One crisp autumn morning, Frank stood on Willow Street, the sun casting golden light across the familiar neighborhood. The street was alive with children playing, their laughter filling the air. As he watched Maya ride her bike down the sidewalk, her hair streaming behind her, Frank felt a deep sense of peace. He had kept his promise. To her, to the other children, and to himself. The fight wasn't over. There were still people like Victor Kane out there. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, to appreciate the lives they had saved and the community they had rebuilt. And as Maya's laughter echoed in the distance, Frank knew that they had made a difference, a lasting one. Months turned into a year, and the story of Frank Reynolds, Maya, and the takedown of Andrew Marshall became a beacon of hope in their community. Maya's light grew into a statewide initiative, its purple butterfly logo recognized as a symbol of resilience and advocacy. Schools incorporated it into their curriculums, and countless children found safety through the hotline and programs it offered. Frank remained a key figure in the program, balancing his police work with community outreach. The walls he'd once built around himself had softened, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Rachel's family dinners became a staple in his life, and he even started coaching a Little League team, channeling his love for baseball into mentoring kids who reminded him of his son. A letter from Maya one quiet morning. Frank found a letter in his mailbox. The envelope was decorated with hand-drawn butterflies and addressed in a familiar scrawl. Dear Frank, I hope you're doing good. Guess what? I got an award at school for helping with Maya's light. My teacher said I was brave, but I told her I learned it from you. I love my new family, and my room is purple just like I wanted. The butterflies on the walls remind me of how we stopped the bad people together. Thank you for not giving up on me. You're my hero. Love. Maya. Frank reread the letter twice, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Maya's words were a reminder of everything he'd fought for, not just to stop Marshall, but to give children like her the chance to live without fear. The legacy continues. The town thrived in the aftermath of the case. People were more vigilant, more compassionate, and more united. Willow Street, once shrouded in secrets, became a symbol of rebirth. The flower bed where Frank had first met Maya now bloomed with vibrant colors, tended to by the neighbors who had come together to restore their community. Frank often found himself walking down that street, reflecting on how far they'd come. He thought of Maya's laugh, of Alvarez's loyalty, and of every life they had saved. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they no longer defined him. As he walked one evening, the distant sound of children's laughter reached his ears. Turning the corner, he saw Maya riding her bike, the streamers on her handlebars fluttering in the breeze. She waved enthusiastically, her smile brighter than ever. Frank waved back, his heart full. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He was a man who had found purpose again, a man who had learned to hope. And in that moment, as the sun set over the town, Frank knew one thing for certain. Even in the darkest times, the smallest voices could spark the brightest lights.